I want to encourage you to turn in your Bible to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12 will simply serve as the backbone for what we're going to look at tonight. It's the call that I believe is exemplified in many saints throughout church history. And it's the call that we find ourselves standing in the middle of even tonight, and especially as we begin a new year. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And then finally in verse 3 as well, he says, consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. I've talked about Jonathan Edwards before, and I want to go into a bit more detail tonight because I believe that he is one of the greatest examples of the faithfulness that's laid out in Hebrews 12, 1 through 2 and 3, to ever really come from American soil. He lived from the early to the middle of the 1700s, and he's one of the most brilliant minds and most impactful leaders that our country has ever seen. Certainly he had his fair share of sin and deficiencies, but even R.C. Sproul says that no greater theologian has come from American soil. Jonathan Edwards set himself out very hard early in his life to be disciplined in all of his studies, and Jonathan Edwards learned very early to be faithful in the little things. That would pay off in ways later in his life that he would have never imagined earlier on. I believe if there's one thing we see from his life is this. You can really be amazed at how great things come from unexpected places. He set out around 18 and 19 years of age to pastor in a very volatile and heated situation. He had completed his coursework for a master's degree at Yale, and he felt called to go to New York City, and he found himself pastoring there in the middle of a recent church split. He knew that he was over his head as a young man at the age of 18, and he began to write a series of 70 resolutions or commitments or life goals that would frame his entire life. He lived very purposefully. He said that it would only be by the Holy Spirit enabling him to keep these resolutions, and that by him reviewing them every week of his life. Everything for Edwards revolved around living all parts of his life to the glory of God. But more specifically, he determined early in his life to do very specific things in his resolution, such as this. He was determined that he would use his time wisely. He was determined that he would speak every word graciously to others. He was determined that he would be quick to forgive eagerly. And he would keep before himself every duty that he undertook in light of the larger perspective in the big picture to do it for the glory of God. So much so that he even says that he'll take care in his eating and in his drinking to do it in a healthy manner of temperance. He resolved that he would be harder on himself than he would be on the people around him. How easy is it to have high expectations for the people around us and lower expectations for ourselves? And so on, they would frame his life. I want us to think first briefly about leading and living in prosperity. Have we been through a season of prosperity in our country over the last couple generations? You better believe we have. Edwards was called to pastor and lead the church in Northampton, Massachusetts, and he led in a very prosperous and an esteemed place. It was in a church that was led for many decades under his beloved and renowned grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. Edwards was faithful under his grandfather even when things were good. And he led with integrity. He would not allow himself to be distracted from the objective before him when things were going good. He wouldn't begin to trust in his own self and his own ability, as so easy it is to do. And such a shining platform as this esteemed church and this place would be, it would only sharpen his faithfulness. He would witness firsthand prosperity through the Great Awakening of the 1740s. Very few things shaped the founding of our country like the Great Awakening would. Both spiritually and practically, in the flourishing of humanity and in salvation, Jonathan Edwards would be at the center of this movement. But secondly, his leadership and prosperity, as we've experienced in our own country for many generations, would turn to leadership under adversity. Jonathan Edwards would stand on some very firm convictions that he would have, and he would be handed a series of very difficult situations that would involve some church discipline concerns. And he would have to lead through these discipline concerns and these doctrinal concerns that time will not allow us to get into tonight. And that season would call for him to be dismissed from the very church that he had poured his entire life into. It's one thing to pour your life into people, but what about when you pour your life into the people around you, and not only do they not appreciate it, but it feels like they're spitting on you as you're investing your life in them, and it feels like there's no fruit coming from the investment that you're seeking to make. Please tell me, has anyone felt that? Anyone? I would hope that we would all by this point have experienced something like a dark season like that. The funny thing is, they fired Jonathan Edwards from the pulpit, but they didn't have anyone to preach when he was gone. So you know what they did? They called him and asked him if he would fill in the pulpit for a while till they could find someone else. You know what you would be thinking? Same thing what I'm thinking. Go find your own pastor. If you don't want this one, Jonathan Edwards refused to do that. He loved these people. He refused to succumb to bitterness. And he continued to do everything for the glory of God, rather than allow dark seasons to make him sour or bitter. He would continue to lend a helping hand to the church in every way he could, even amidst the way that he was treated. And I believe the last year and a half in our country has definitely put us in a position of not living and leading in prosperity, but leaning into adversity. Thirdly, Edwards moved from leading in prosperity, where he was dearly loved by everyone around him, to leading in adversity, where he was despised by many, to then thirdly and finally leading in obscurity, where very few people even knew he existed. He would go on from Northampton to minister in a town called Stockbridge among the Native Americans. So I want you to picture this. Arguably the most brilliant mind, arguably the most gifted individual to ever come from American soil, is now laboring in the middle of nowhere in a seemingly insignificant place with absolutely no recognition, fanfare, no platform, nothing. And he refused over and over to live for his own self-glory. Edwards did not see people as stepping stones to his own success. He invested his life into people through thick and thin. He invested in these Native Americans, proclaiming Christ, planting the church, discipling them one at a time, and doing that with humility, doing that with integrity, doing that with loyalty when it seemed like nobody else noticed. Do you understand how big of a deal that is? We can't even go to the grocery store without posting everything we do on Facebook. I mean, you get on Facebook and you know the bathroom habits of all of your friends. We can't do anything without telling the entire world, can we? Well, you're laughing because you know it's true. Here's a man serving so faithfully, screaming for no fanfare, and wanting to be resolved. He wasn't insecure. He wasn't eager to raise himself at the expense of the people around him. And they trusted him. He would experience tremendous loss, even the loss of his own daughter, at the hands of helping other people, men such as David Brainerd, who would contract an illness that his daughter would end up receiving and caring for David Brainerd. His son-in-law, Aaron Burr Sr., died. He was the founder of what's now called Princeton University, and he was father to the infamous, anyone ever heard of Aaron Burr? Aaron Burr, the third vice president of the United States, who had a bit of an interaction with a man named Alexander Hamilton, which is another story for another day. Edwards was invited to take his place at Princeton. He was elevated finally to a place of what the world would consider significant as the president of what would later become called Princeton. Jonathan Edwards was the president of Princeton. What do you think of when you think of Ivy Leagues today? Probably not Jonathan Edwards, but it shows you where the roots started. Within a matter of a few weeks after accepting that post, Jonathan Edwards would die. He would only be there for a few weeks. And you say, what would become of all of this laboring and living and loving people in prosperity, in adversity, in obscurity? It would lead to what would have never been expected. It would lead to one of the greatest American legacies that would come from Jonathan Edwards' family line. From his family line would come 300 clergymen, missionaries, and theological professors. From his line would come 120 college professors, 110 lawyers, over 60 physicians, over 60 authors. From Jonathan Edwards' line would come 30 judges, 14 presidents of universities, numerous giants in American industry, 80 holders of public office, 3 mayors of large cities, 3 governors of states, 3 U.S. senators, 1 chaplain of the United States Senate, 1 controller of the U.S. Treasury, and 1 vice president of the United States. That's not to mention his spiritual influence through all of the charitable work that came from his leadership. You say, how does a woman get to that? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the hand and the providence of God, but more immediately, I would argue that it all goes back to a young man at the age of 18 or 19 years of age. God got a grip of his heart, and he set out to write 70 resolutions that would frame every ounce of his life to the glory of God, where he would be faithful in little things, and the world would be amazed at what God would do in such unexpected places. I want you to look in your booklet with me at the center section, and let's read a few of the resolutions that he made, because this is the sort of thing that our world thinks about. When we think about resolutions, maybe we think about the resolution to lose weight. At the beginning of the year, ask any gym owner, their membership's out the roof, and by February, it's plummeted. We think of resolutions that come and go, but that's not how he or many in church history thought of them. They thought of it not as a sort of self-help, but something that they believed the Bible teaches, and something that they thought would be only possible through the church by the Holy Spirit. Look with me at resolution number 1. One category of his resolutions really is his overall life mission and his character. It says in number 1 on page 17, resolve that I will do whatsoever I think to be most to God's glory and to my own good, profit, and pleasure. And the whole of my duration, without any consideration of the time, whether now or never so many myriads of ages hence, resolve to do whatever I think to be my duty, and most for the good of it and advantage of mankind in general. Resolve to do this, whatever difficulties I meet with, however so many and however so great. He would be at this church in New York City for about 8 months, and he would write these resolutions over a season of about 8 months as well. Look with me at another one, number 6. At the bottom of the page, he says, resolve to live with all my might while I do live. Number 22, page 19. Resolve to endeavor to obtain for myself as much happiness in the other world as I possibly can, with all the power, might, vigor, and vehemence, yea, violence I'm capable of, or can bring myself to exert in any way that can be thought of. In his overall life, mission, and his character, I think it can be summarized by one of the resolutions that he wrote, which is my favorite, when he said, I hope to live in such a way now that I would have wished that I would have lived when I come to die. That's a good resolution. That's a good resolution. What about his relationships? Look with me on page 20 at number 31. Number 31, page 20. Resolve never to say anything at all against anybody, but when it is perfectly agreeable to the highest degree of Christian honor and of love to mankind, agreeable to the lowest humility and a sense of my own faults and failings, and agreeable to the golden rule. Often when I have said anything against anyone, to bring it to and try it strictly by the test of this resolution. In other words, there's going to be a culture of honor in his life and the way that he speaks. Before he is tempted to say anything wrong, negative, disagreeable about anyone else and their fallings, their failures, he said, I'm going to first consider how great my failures are. And I'm going to view their failures through how great my own are. Number 33, resolved always to do what I can towards making, maintaining, and preserving peace, when it can be without overbalancing detriment to other respects. In other words, so far as the gospel and sound doctrine is not compromised, I'm going to do everything I can to maintain peace. One other, number 34, resolved in narrations never to speak anything but the pure and simple verity or truth. He was very resolved in the way that he would speak and use his tongue. The tongue has the power of life and death, doesn't it? To give life and to take it. What about his time management? Look with me at number 5. Number 5 on page 17 says, resolve never to lose one moment of time, but improve it the most profitable way I possibly can. Number 17, page 18, he said, resolve that I will live so as I shall wish I had done when I come to die, which is what I mentioned earlier. Number 18, he said, resolve to live so at all times as I think is best in my devout frame, and when I have the clearest notion of things of the gospel in another world. You know, I think one thing that could be convicting to me, and maybe you as well, I think that he was resolved not to flitter away large amounts of his time scrolling through social media, getting lost in meaningless YouTube videos, squandering his time hours and weeks on end into insignificant leisure opportunities. Not that any of those things are bad in themselves, especially leisure. But he was determined not to waste the one and only life that God would give him. What about suffering? Number 9. Page 18 said, resolve to think much on all occasions of my own dying, and of the common circumstances which attend death. You know, I did a funeral the other day, and people kind of look at me weird when I say this, but the truth is, I have realized about myself that I need to either lead or attend a funeral every now and then. And here's why I say that. I have noticed that as a common trait of humanity, people can be unbelievably short-sighted and petty. Have you ever noticed how petty people can be? Getting caught up and consumed in the silliest, stupidest, most insignificant matters in life. Anyone? Do you know what happens when you go to a funeral? It puts all of life into perspective. And it shows us in our pettiness just what's important in life. Look at number 10. Resolved when I feel pain to think of the pains of martyrdom and of hell. Number 57. He refers again to suffering, expecting that life would not be a bed of roses. He said, resolved on page 24, when I fear misfortunes and adversities, to examine whether I had done my duty and resolved to do it, and let it be just as providence orders it. In other words, I accept by God's providence whatever He brings in my life, and I'll examine my life when suffering comes. I will, as far as I can, be concerned about nothing but my duty and my sin. He wrote all sorts of resolutions about his spiritual life, about his prayer life, about his commitment to the body of Christ, about the pillars that ought to be in every Christian's life, such as their communion with the Lord. And one particular element that he wrote a good bit about as it pertains to a spiritual life is his daily Bible reading. And that's where I want to end this evening, and hopefully even us talk about for a few minutes, is I want you to consider where you ought to be resolved anew this year, and I want us to consider being resolved in this one particular area in 2022, and it is very simple, but it is very significant. I want to charge us as a church to be resolved in reading the Bible every day. And I want to talk about that for just a minute. I think that is so significant and so easy to overlook. By far, the greatest spiritual means of grace and the greatest formative aspect of my entire Christian life has been reading the Bible every day. I have spent most of my life in seminary. I have had a lot of blessings and means of grace in my life, but I'm telling you, nothing has shaped my life more like reading the Bible. I have more books, more commentaries than probably multiple continents combined. But nothing, I'm telling you, nothing influences my life like just reading the Bible and studying the Bible every day, week in and week out. How many of you would say the same? When you approach the Bible, I think there's a couple different ways that you can do it. You can approach the Bible on one level with a mindset of intimacy. What that means is that you're desiring to read a few verses and to experience communion with the Lord and really zero in on one, two, or a short number of verses. How many of you like to read the Bible that way? So you're not wanting to race through it, you're wanting to slow down and chew every bite. Amen. Any of you have any friends, family that goes to a steakhouse, they order a steak or some of the finest meat, and then they have ate it in like 2 minutes flat, and then you say, did you even taste that? Well, when you read the Bible for intimacy, it means you're slowing down. But I believe there's another way to read the Bible, and that's not for intimacy, but for familiarity. When I study for my sermons, I read the Bible more so for intimacy, and I want to digest every aspect. In my life, I read the Bible on a daily basis, and I read it for familiarity. I want to share with you quickly how me and Christy read the Bible, but before I do this, I already know what some of you are going to say. I can't do it that way. I'm not sharing this with you because I want to encourage you to do it this way. I already know that's what some of you will say. Different strokes for different folks. All I'm doing is saying, if you're not reading the Bible, I like my way better than your way. If you are reading the Bible and that's working for you, keep shooting that bullet. I think there's a ton of different ways that you can read the Bible that are fruitful and effective. I sent out recently plans by the ministries of Ligonier, Church and Family Life, Tim Challies. There's so many different ways to read the Bible. But what I've been doing for about 15 years now, every single year, is I've been reading through the daily John MacArthur Daily Bible. Christy's been doing that for a long time with me now. So what we do is we read the Bible in the mornings for familiarity. I am not trying to understand every little piece when I read the Bible. I'm just simply trying to touch everything that I can and get the big picture. Some people read through Leviticus and after 3 verses, they're like, forget it. Just forget it. Anyone ever done that? I know I have. I'm not trying to understand, was it the peace offering or was it what in the world are they doing with that animal? When I read the Bible on a daily basis, I'm just trying to get the big picture, and I'm just trying to be familiar with the flow of redemptive history. Does that make sense? That's one way to read it. So in the MacArthur Daily Bible, I personally like it because you read a little bit of the Old Testament every day, you read a little bit of the New Testament every day, and then you read a couple verses from Proverbs and Psalms. I like doing it that way because for me it feels like a balanced diet. I don't particularly care to get bogged down in Numbers or Leviticus for 3 weeks. I like a little bit of variety. Other people hate doing it that way because they get confused, and that's perfectly fine. What Christy does, and I've noticed that this has begun to help a few other people in the church, is she'll read it, but as she reads it, how many of you are not going to get distracted until you start reading something? Soon as you start reading, mind's a million miles away. Anyone? So what she'll do is read it, and then she'll listen to it through a Bible app as she's reading the same thing, and it can help it to soak in and help to stay focused. One other thing that we do in family worship, we're reading through the Bible, and I found a little book that takes you through the Proverbs, and it's listed out by day, and every day you read like literally 3 verses from Proverbs, and after a few months you read through all the Proverbs. So we've started doing that. We'll read through 2 or 3 verses in Proverbs and talk about it. So I want to encourage you, if you don't already have a plan to read the Bible, to be thinking about how you'll do that personally. Be thinking about how you will read the Bible as a family together. On Sunday evenings, we always go through the service. So we'll read all of the sermon texts. We'll read really the same thing I send out to you. That's our family worship on Saturdays, so that we're familiar with the verses that'll be read. You can do it completely different than that. I just want to encourage you to read. And when you start reading through the Bible, whether you read a book a year, whether you read the New Testament a year, whether you read the Bible in a year, I'm not really so concerned about that. But I want you to remember one thing as you read the Bible. How many of you have ever set out to read the Bible, and then before you know it, you didn't read today, you didn't read this week, and you haven't even read this month? Anyone honest enough? What happens when you do that? I definitely have done that. is you guilt yourself into just not even going back to the Bible again at all. What I want to encourage you to do, whether it's personal Bible reading or family worship, is this: expect that you're going to fall off the horse. We know ourselves well enough to know that life's going to happen, right? Go ahead and resolve that when you do fall off the horse, when you fall off the course that you set out on whatever you want to read, you're just going to get back on the horse and you're just going to start reading the next day. Just pick up where you left off. If you want to start a Bible and a year plan, why do you have to finish it in a year? Maybe you want to. You don't have to.